Hello, Robs. We're back with Buried Alive, the terrifying history of our most primal fear by Jan Bondeson. Or is it Bandison? Bondeson. Let me set up the chat. Control V, part 2. Save. Open this thing. And let's get it on. What do you got, buddy? All I got is books. Nothing else. No soul, buddy. Just books. I must turn this volume down. Or we're going to get in that go. Here we go, Brobs. You ready? Let's do it, Brobs. Chapter 10, I believe this is. Ow. Is that what I put on there? No. Yeah. Chapter 10. Chapter 10. I assume we're here. A time-honored literary use of the apparent death theme is that some sorcerer or skillful physician possesses a drug capable of inducing a cataleptic trance, indistinguishable from death itself. After being declared dead, the individual who has taken this drug can return from the tomb in a later chapter. To create a dramatic effect, as we saw, this theme was used by Boccaccio. It also occurs in Alexander Dumas's The Count of Monte Cristo. Here the young Valentine de Villefort, the daughter of the wicked procurator, how do you say that? Procurator, who had deceived Edmond Dantes, is gradually poisoned by her murderous stepmother, who had already killed off a considerable part of the family to secure her own son's inheritance. The omnipotent Monte Cristo, who has seen through her nefarious plot, comes up with a clever, if rather far-fetched, plan of his own. With a powerful antidote, he neutralizes the poison every time it is administered. And finally, he visits the girl at night to inform her of the impending danger. This time, he replaces the poison with a drug of his own, which is capable of inducing a state of deep trance. With these words, whatever may happen, Valentine, do not be alarmed, though you may suffer, though you may lose sight, hearing, consciousness. Fear nothing, even if you should awake and be ignorant where you are, still do not fear. Even if you should find yourself in a sepulchral vault or a coffin, this overblown tirade is, little wonder, greeted with the cry, "Alas, alas, what a fearful extremity!" from the terrified girl. Everything moves smoothly according to Monte Cristo's plan. However, declared dead by both doctor and coroner, Mille de Villefort is interred in the family vault. After the Villefort family has been rightfully punished, the distraught count does not forget to have Valentine rescued from the vault and reunited with her fiancé. After she had been buried alive for almost 100 pages, the French author Guy de Maupassant admired Edgar Allan Poe, and some of his masterly short stories clearly show Poe's influence. The uncertainty of the signs of death and the horror of a reviving corpse is a recurring theme in some of his more macabre productions. In the short story Les Souris de Schopenhauer, the narrator meets a consumptive German who was once a student of the great German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. I don't know why yesterday I thought of Schopenhauer and thought maybe his name Arthur, but maybe it's Arthur. Although the Frenchman detests Schopenhauer's skeptical and sarcastic ideas, He listens attentively when the German speaks about how his master used to sit at the beer cellar discussing philosophy, smiling his characteristic horrible smile. After Schopenhauer's death, his devoted students took turns to wake over the body. The corpse appeared remarkably lifelike. The face had its unforgettable smile, and the two students, who would have expected the great man to stand up any moment had it not been for the pungent fumes of putrefaction, suddenly one of them heard a noise from the room with the corpse, and they decided to investigate. The German student was horrified to see that Schopenhauer was no longer smiling. Instead, the face was contorted into a horrible grimace. He called out, "He is not dead!" But there was no denying the appalling stench. The ludicrous denouement, sorry, I forgot that's how I actually know how to pronounce that. Ludicrous denouement is that the other student suddenly pointed to the floor. There lay Schopenhauer's dentures, complete with their springs, which had been catapulted out of the mouth when decomposition had loosened the rigidity of the jaw muscles. It is unknown whether this powerful, macabre story was inspired by some similar mishap during a death vigil in Paris, or whether Maupassant had read some newspaper report of Schopenhauer's last days and his precautions against premature burial. Another of Bonbonson's well-known short stories, L'Éthique, shows the influence of Poe even more clearly. At a spa, the narrator meets a Frenchman and with prematurely white hair, who has come there with his invalid daughter Juliet. The Frenchman has a spastic mannerism. Every time he wants to reach something, his hand makes a rapid, swerving movement before he can take what he wants. The daughter always wears a glove on one hand. Walking with the narrator in the park of the spa, the white-haired Frenchman tells him their strange story. Poor Juliet was suffering from what was thought to be heart attacks, and one day she collapsed and could not be revived. A doctor declared her dead, and the father had her buried in the family vault after a death vigil of 2 days. She was buried with all the jewelry he had given her and dressed in her party frock. When returning home after the funeral, the distraught father, half mad with grief, dismissed his old valet, Prosper, and sat all night in front of the cold, empty fireplace, mourning his daughter. Suddenly, there was a loud peal of the doorbell, which echoed through the empty house as if it were a vault. Surprised and fearful, the old man went to open the door. A mysterious white figure stood outside. When the old man asked, "Who are you?" it replied, "Father, it's me," and advanced toward him. Convinced that he was seeing a ghost, the terrified Frenchman retreated, trying to ward off the apparition by making a gesture with his hand, which stayed with him as a spastic mannerism ever since. Juliet finally managed to explain that she had been buried alive and that someone had dug up her coffin and then cut off one of her fingers to steal a valuable ring. The blood flow from the amputation had restored her to life. The father helped her inside and rang the bell for his faithful old valet to light the fires. But when the valet entered the room and saw the girl, he opened his mouth in a gasp of horror and fell backward, stone dead. It was, of course, he who had robbed and mutilated the corpse. And just as in Maupassant's source, the legend of the lady with the ring, the thieving menial met with a both prompt and suitable punishment. In 1884, at the same time that Maupassant published his short stories, Emile Zola's La Mort d'Olivier Bacal appeared. The protagonist of this story is a frail invalid Frenchman, the victim of repeated nervous attacks. He marries a much younger wife and moves with her to Paris. Not long afterward, he again falls ill, and his wife and landlady believe that he has, in fact, expired. But just like the traditional victim of the death trance, Olivier is still conscious and can hear and feel everything, although unable to move or speak. His wife and landlady keep vigil over the corpse, and a doctor is called to write out the death certificate. Olivier awaits the arrival of the medical practitioner with impatience. Surely, this well trained, competent professional must recognize that he is not dead, just a lifeless victim of epilepsy. But poor Olivier's trust in medical science is sadly misplaced. A tired, careless doctor appears and does not even listen for the heartbeat or feel the pulse. He just writes out the death certificate and leaves. Again, like the traditional victim of the Shine Todd, whose torments were described in so many scaremongering pamphlets, Olivier is unable to make it known that he is still alive. Although the preparations for his burial are going on all around him. He is put in a coffin, the lid is nailed down, and he hears the voice of the priest during the funeral. Before fainting, when the coffin is rudely dumped down into the grave. When Olivia wakes up, his cataleptic fit is over, and he can move again, but as his hands pass along the wooden boards of the coffin, he remembers his desperate situation. I screamed, and my voice, reverberating in the pine box, sounded so awful that it terrified me. My God, was it true then? I could talk, cry out that I lived, and my voice could not be heard. I was a helpless prisoner under the earth. He screams, scratches the coffin lid with his nails, and bites his arms in agony. With an almost superhuman effort, the Frenchman then manages to regain his sang-froid. Sang-froid? Sang-froid? I can't remember how to say that. I know the word. Using a nail extricated from the coffin, he tries to make a deep gash in the coffin lid. Turning over on his stomach and rising to his knees, he is able to split the lid from one end to the other. But his plan to use the lid as some kind of shield while tunneling upward from the grave comes to nothing, since great clods of earth fall down on him and the board is almost impossible to move. Instead, he tries kicking at the end of the coffin with his heels, and it gives way surprisingly easily. It turns out that another grave has been dug next to his, and Olivier pushes through a thin wall of earth and crawls into it. He is saved with surprising vigor, considering the ordeal he has just been through. He climbs up from the grave and begins to walk home. He collapses in the street, however, and spends 6 weeks unconscious at a private hospital. After being permitted to take a short walk by his doctor, Olivier wants to see what has happened to his young wife. Afraid that she would be killed by the shock of seeing him again, he decides to first seek out his landlady. He overhears the landlady gossiping at the local cafe, saying that Olivier's death was really all for the best. His poor wife was better off being rid of this dissatisfied, grumbling invalid, and she should definitely marry her new admirer, a younger and more attractive lodger. The philosophical Olivier agrees that he is better off dead and sets out to travel the world. Death no longer terrifies him, and like the protagonist of Poe's The Premature Burial, he becomes a saner and healthier man. The two stories also share the first person narrative and the mysterious cataleptic condition of the victim. But here the similarities end. While Poe's protagonist is basically a figure of fun whose exaggerated fear of premature burial is ridiculed, there is no hint in Zola's story that Olivier Bical has any similar fears, in spite of his alarming medical condition. Apart from Poe, Zola was probably also inspired by one of the many anti premature burial pamphlets of the time. The description of Olivier's cataleptic death trance resembles those touted in the pamphlets, and Zola's argument that the wretched man did not suffocate in the coffin, that an individual used almost no oxygen while in the death trance, could almost have been directly quoted from one of these publications, as could the mechanism given for for his awakening in the warm, fertilizing earth. The Swedish author Selma Lagerlöf was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1909 for her powerful novels, The Story of Gösta Berling and The Ring of the Lowenskölds, and for her classic children's book, The Wonderful Adventures of Nils. One of her less well-known novels was the hell does that say? Hergridssagen, 1895, translated into English under the title From a Swedish Homestead. Any person who bought this book expecting a sober, realistic account of Scandinavian rural life would be dismayed by its weird, dramatic plot, however. The novel's hero is the scapegrace, never heard that word, scapegrace young student Gunnar Heed, who neglects his studies to play the violin. To recoup his fortunes, he buys a large herd of goats and shepherds them through the cold Scandinavian landscape toward a market town. They are caught in a blizzard, however, and every single animal expires. After this tragedy, Heed loses his reason and becomes the billy goat, an insane tramp who curtsies politely every time he meets an animal. One day, the billy goat strays into a graveyard and sits down near a newly dug grave. As he is playing his violin, he hears a movement inside the coffin that has been put in the grave and decides to unscrew the lid. Perceiving that the young woman inside the coffin is alive, he lifts her out. She turns out to be a girl named Ingrid, who was presumed to have died of grief after being badly treated by her wicked stepmother. She reflects on her narrow escape from a premature burial with these words: "What would have become of her if she had not come? If he had not come? She would have woken up inside the dark coffin. She would have knocked on its lid and cried out loud. But who would have heard her when she was buried alive under 6 feet of earth?" The billy goat carries her back to the stepmother's house in a large bag. There, the stepmother is busy telling her servant that they are just as well off without Ingrid, and that her death was no great loss. When Ingrid steps out of the bag, the stepmother faints, and the servant flees in horror. Ingrid is taken away by the billy goat, and they have many further dramatic adventures before the ending of this remarkable novel. Selma Lagerlöf was well read in Swedish folklore, and it is likely that From a Swedish Homestead was inspired by 2 traditional folk tales. One about the love of a woman saving the reason of a man half transformed into an animal. There is no evidence that Selma Lagerlöf herself feared premature burial, but a near contemporary, the famous Danish storyteller Hans Christian Andersen, lived in fear of awakening in a coffin. Just like Wilkie Collins, he distrusted foreign doctors, and he always carried a card with him saying, "I am not really dead," which he put on the dressing table whenever he stayed at a hotel abroad to prevent some careless doctor from wrongly declaring him dead. 2 days before his death in 1875, Anderson asked a friend to make sure that his arteries were cut before he was buried. A Danish contemporary of his, the eccentric writer Niels Nielsen, was even more frightened of premature burial. He suggested that every recently dead person should be put to bed with a meal of cakes, wine, and beer ready on a table next to the bed, so that a tasty meal would be provided in the case of an unexpected resuscitation. After the doors and windows of the house of the deceased were shuttered, this building should be abandoned and a new one be built next to it for the family of the deceased. In Sweden, Alfred Nobel was another victim of the fear of premature burial. He ended the same will that stipulated the creation of the Nobel Foundation with these words: "Finally, it is my express wish that my arteries be opened after death." And thereafter this has been done, and competent doctors certified that clear signs of death are present. My body be burnt in a crematorium oven. Some minor late 19th century authors also used the premature burial theme. The eccentric Englishman Frederick Rolfe, who called himself Baron Corvo, claimed that he had himself been buried alive by mistake. When studying for the priesthood in Rome, falling into a trance-like state after being frightened by a little lizard, he was coffined and walled up in a niche in an ancient church. He regained the strength, however, broke out of the coffin, and climbed down from the niche. The tale was published in a leading periodical and illustrated with drawings of Baron Corvo's fearful experience, done under his own supervision. Similarly ludicrous was Mrs. Harriet Lewis's sensation novel, The Haunted Husband, which featured, among many other improbable occurrences, a premature burial and the substitution of a wax effigy. In Gertrude Atherton's short story, The Dead and the Countess, a superstitious village priest is convinced that the dead in his churchyard are disturbed by the noise from the newly built railway line next to it. Every time the train comes by, he sprinkles all the graves with holy water and imagines that the dead people speak to him. One evening, he visits a local nobleman, the Count de Croizac, whose wife had been buried the day before. He tells the Count that the dead people in his churchyard are being annoyed by the trains, and the nobleman believes him to be a madman. He then speaks of the frightful smothered moaning sound he had just heard from the Countess's grave, and the Count rushes off just in time to save his prematurely buried wife. In Arthur Conan Doyle's short story, The Disappearance of Lady Frances Carfax, I wonder if that's where Carfax came from, two Australian con artists kidnap a wealthy noblewoman, and plan to have her buried alive. But Sherlock Holmes is hot on their trail. He intercepts the hearse, opens the coffin, and has Dr. Watson resuscitate the chloroformed Lady Frances. In a letter to his friend and fellow horror writer Clark Ashton Smith, H.P. Lovecraft discussed the problem of making a tale about premature burial plausible for the 20th century reader. In reference to one of Smith's stories, Lovecraft wrote that since the practice of embalming became universally accepted, the writer had to think up a reason for the individuals not being embalmed before he could introduce this horrible theme in a story. Several of Lovecraft's contemporaries did so. In John Dickson Carr's The Three Coffins, published in 1935, three Hungarian brothers imprisoned for bank robbery think of a daring method of escape, perhaps after reading Dumas's Monte Cristo. With the aid of a prison doctor, they are certified dead during a plague epidemic and buried alive in the prison cemetery outside the walls. The coffins are nailed shut, but the men have nail cutters with them in the coffins. One of them succeeds in breaking open the coffin and digs his way to the surface, callously leaving his brothers behind. One of them is later found suffocated in his coffin, the other bloody and insensible, but still alive. The American Cornell Woolrich added further horrors in his short story, Grave for the Living. In the beginning of the story, an insensitive police official shows the exhumed body of a war invalid to his wife and 10-year-old son. He demonstrates the broken fingernails, clawed coffin lid, blood spattered shroud, and face contorted with horror, and tells them that the man was buried alive by mistake and slowly suffocated to death in his coffin. The wife faints on the spot and afterward goes insane. The son grows obsessed with the risk of premature burial. In his adult years, he becomes engaged to a wealthy heiress with the same morbid interest. He also becomes involved with a sinister secret society called the Friends of Death, consisting mainly of people with an insane fear of premature burial. They claimed to possess the secret of eternal life, and when one of their number died, skilled scientists administered a secret treatment before the body was buried in a coffin, with an air tube and an alarm. When returning to life, he would push a button to sound the alarm, and the other friends of death would come and dig him up. After such an experience, he should no longer fear either death or burial. In exchange, this ghoulish society demands steady payments of money and implicit loyalty from its members. The young man is prepared to give neither, and the friends of death exact their revenge. He is overpowered, shrouded, and put in a coffin to be buried alive, but tells them about his wealthy fiancée. They then release him, kidnap her, and bury her alive in his stead. With the help of the police, he finds her in time, and she awakes with a shriek of unutterable horror when the coffin lid is removed. The conclusion of this wild tale is that the police arrest the friends of death. It turns out that far from having discovered the secret of immortality, they had deliberately poisoned their own members with the narcotic drug and buried them alive. When rescued from the security coffins, they no longer feared death and told other prospective members about their immortality. Woolrich himself feared premature burial and turned to the theme in at least one other story. He probably got the idea for a grave for the living from Poe's tales, or possibly from one of the brochures about 19th century security coffins. The prolific English thriller writer Dennis Wheatley made another use of the premature burial theme in his novel The Ka of Gifford, Hilary. A wealthy baronet is killed by a mad Welsh scientist who has previously seduced his wife. The demented Welshman shoots Sir Gifford with a death ray he has invented, but the baronet is not quite dead. Just as the late 19th century spiritualists had feared, his spirit has left the body, but he has to return to it after burial. Fortunately, Sir Gifford had been fearful of death, of being buried alive, and equipped his coffin with air holes. In Michael Crichton's novel, The Great Train Robbery, the security coffin known as Bateson's Belfry is put to an unexpected use. The corpse of a young man is transported on a passenger train. When the bell on top of the coffin suddenly starts ringing, the lid is quickly unscrewed and his sister throws herself down to embrace what she thought was her still living brother. But she halted in mid gesture, which was perfectly understandable. With the raising of the lid, a most hideous, fetid, foul stench rolled forth in a near palpable wave, and its source was not hard to determine. The girl faints, and the stench is such that the entire station platform becomes deserted. The coffin is quickly resealed, and put into a compartment next to a safe where a lot of gold bullion was transported. But inside the coffin is a thief who has smeared himself with the innards of a dead dog to produce a putrid smell. He is led out of the coffin by a colleague and proceeds to plunder the safe. The premature burial theme has also spawned a number of films, many of them loosely based on Poe's The Premature Burial. The first was The Crime of Dr. Crespi from 1935, directed by John H. Auer, and starring Erich von Stroheim as a wicked hospital doctor who plans revenge on a rival by plotting to have him buried alive. One of the episodes in the popular American 1960s TV series Thriller, hosted by Boris Karloff, see, it's a sign, was the 1961 The Premature Burial, which also acknowledged the debt to Poe's tale. A wealthy man suffers from a cataleptic disease and becomes obsessed with the risk of being buried alive during one of his seizures. His unfaithful wife deliberately ensures that he is entombed alive, however. Karloff himself co stars as a doctor who is a friend of the prematurely buried man and who eventually uncovers the truth about the wife's sinister doings. In 1962, Roger Corman's The Premature Burial appeared in the cinemas. The plot actually bears some resemblance to Poe's original story in that the hero Guy Carell, played by Ray Milland, is a neurotic creature obsessed with the risk of being buried alive. After one of his cataleptic fits, he even has a security crypt constructed to make sure that he will survive if the worst happens. Trying to prove to himself that he has been cured of his phobia, he opens his father's vault, but instead suffers one of his fits and is afterward found in a senseless condition. He is put in a coffin and lowered into a grave, and although a close relation of his has noted that he is still alive, she allows the funeral to go on. It is instructive that the transition between an accidental and a deliberate premature burial has been made in almost every cinematic adaptation of the theme. By this time, the fear of being mistakenly buried alive had become dormant, but the theme of a revival in the coffin still had its ghoulish fascination. If Corman's film somewhat resembles Poe's original story, the opposite is true for Edgar Allan Poe's Buried Alive, directed by Gerard Kikkoman and released in 1990. A still from Roger Corman's film The Premature Burial. The heroine attains. Oh, Jesus Christ. The heroine arrives at Ravenscroft Hall, a school for troubled teenage girls, to become the assistant to the charming and sinister psychiatrist who is in charge of this establishment. The school used to be in an asylum for criminal lunatics, and the heroine soon begins to suffer nightmares about the brutal murders committed by one of these madmen. The obvious sequel is that the pupils start disappearing and that it turns out that the killer is still alive. Other directors have followed suit in discarding the theme of Poe's gloomy, morbid story and replacing it with a storyline more familiar to the American adolescent filmgoer, that of a number of frightened, scantily dressed young blondes being sadistically murdered. Another strange adaptation of Poe's story, Haunting Fear, by the director Fred Olen Ray, also released in 1990, is eulogized on an internet site by an enthusiastic amateur critic who recommends it to devotees of Nightmare on Elm Street 3 and other splatter B movies. Still available on video is also the 1991 movie Buried Alive, directed by Frank Darabont and starring Tim Matheson as a man poisoned and buried alive by his faithless wife and her doctor friend. This film was successful enough to spawn a sequel, Buried Alive 2 of 1997, directed by Matheson himself and using much the same storyline, except that it is now Matheson's niece, played by Ellie Sheedy, who is deliberately buried alive. Wes Craven's The Serpent and the Rainbow also uses the premature burial theme, and Fox Mulder was buried alive in an episode of The X-Files. Don't remember that. More recommendable for the reader who wants to see a really thrilling movie with the premature burial theme and also much more critically acclaimed than any of those mentioned above is the Dutch film Spoorloos, directed by George Sluizer and based on a short story by Tim Crabb. It was re-released as The Vanishing in 1988 with English subtitles. A young married Dutch couple take a break at a rest stop after returning from a bicycling vacation in France. The wife goes in to buy some cold drinks, and the husband never sees her again. He then grows increasingly obsessed with finding her, or at least knowing what became of her. For 3 years, he travels the country looking for her, puts advertisements in the newspapers, and even appears on TV with an appeal for witnesses. The uncertainty of not knowing what happened to her is driving him insane. Finally, he is contacted by the kidnapper, a clever psychopath, who offers to satisfy his curiosity, but only if the husband is willing to undergo the same experience as his wife. The murderer puts a sedative in the husband's coffee, and asks him to drink, then he will wake up feeling exactly what his wife felt. The reader should be able to guess exactly in what situation he woke up. Not unexpectedly, this brutal, disquieting ending was a little hard to swallow for the American film moguls. George Sleezer was hired to direct the remake of the film with an American cast featuring Kiefer Sutherland and Sandra Bullock as the married couple and Jeff Bridges as the murderer, and with a very artificial, happy ending to the story. I've seen that movie. It's not bad. And that's the end of chapter 10. All right, bros. How many more pages are left? 238. So 44 pages. Let's say 2 more chapters. There's this one huge chapter coming up. Nope, there's 2 chapters. So 258. It's basically split in half. That's all, bro. That's all. Goodbye.